All right, let's get going. Welcome everyone to Comprehension, Knowledge to Practice, part of the Professional Learning Series webinars that we began back in January. For those of you who are attending for a second or a third time, welcome back. For those of you who are new to our series, we're very happy to have you. We're happy to have all of you. I'm Margie Gillis, and I'm the president of Literacyhow. And Nancy will introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Nancy Eberhardt, and I have the pleasure of being the co-author with Margie on the Professional Learning Series, and it's a pleasure to be back with you this week.
So we're going to jump right in, make the best use of our hour together this evening. Our message here is that literacy is the key to opportunity. Children are always at the heart of what we do because we believe that reading is a civil right. 95% of all children can be taught to read, and we believe that teachers are the key variable, not the programs or the products as much, but the teachers and the knowledge that they have. So we empower teachers with the best ways to teach. Tonight, we're going to talk about comprehension, which everyone would agree is the goal of reading, even for beginning readers. When we began this journey, and it has been a journey to write this particular book particularly, is we always start with what are our big ideas? What are the things that we believe are most important related to whatever the topic is, in this case, comprehension. And we came up with these 5 big ideas: text structure, background knowledge, coherence, inference, and then last but not least, the reading-writing connection. Tonight, you're going to hear about background knowledge, coherence, and inference. In the interest of time, we'd love to talk more about each of those, but we're going to focus on those 3. We're also going to talk about the importance of text analysis, and that text analysis will allow us to focus on what the particular language processing demands are of that specific text that we're either reading to children or we're asking them to read. And then last but not least, we're going to take an in-depth look at some of our favorite Literacyhow activities that we've created for these 3 big ideas that I mentioned. And we'll start by looking at the Literacyhow reading wheel. Some of you are familiar with it, but some of you may not be. Last session that we had back in February, we focused on phonemic awareness and phonics, 2 of the sections of the wheel that are extremely important, especially for foundational reading skills. And this evening, you're going to notice that we're going to focus, we're going to sort of do another twist or turn, if you will, and we're going to focus on comprehension. As you'll notice, comprehension is in the same section of the wheel with written expression, and you may remember just from the last slide that we believe there is an important reading-writing connection. So we have those 2 in the same section. They're reciprocal skills. Next month in April, we're going to talk about syntax and the importance of syntax both for fluency as well as comprehension. And in May, we'll cap off our webinar series with a discussion of vocabulary and a little bit of morphology. So we usually frame our conversations with our 2 views of reading. One is the simple view as depicted here in these cartoons. That is that reading comprehension is the product of listening comprehension and decoding. An expanded view of that is Hollis Scarborough's rope that you see here, where you see the language comprehension side of the equation is at the top of the rope. And at the bottom of the rope, you see word recognition that many people see as synonymous with decoding. And to the far right, we have reading comprehension. Now, last time we were together, if you joined us, we introduced you to an expanded view of reading. And this really has most of the same components that Hollis's rope does, but it just frames, and no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, frames the components slightly differently. And what you're going to see in this slide is that we add background knowledge to this expanded view of reading, and you're going to find out why throughout this presentation. But we see it having an arrow leading up to reading comprehension and also going from reading comprehension to background knowledge. And why is that? It's because actually background knowledge adds to reading comprehension, right? The more we know, the better our reading comprehension. And reading comprehension will actually help create more background knowledge and help us build our background knowledge. And what we show you in this next slide is the right side of the house, where we've highlighted in blue all the sections of that particular side of the house related to listening comprehension. And so you're going to hear us tonight talking about inferencing. You're not going to hear us talking about comprehension monitoring per se, but that is certainly implied in a lot of our conversation about comprehension. You're also going to see text structure and knowledge as one of the rooms in the house. And if you remember, text structure is one of our 5 big ideas. But again, we had to be selective this evening in what we decided to focus on. Underneath those 3 rooms, you're going to see vocabulary and grammar. And those 2 domains are very much related to comprehension. And as I mentioned, you're going to hear about vocabulary in May if you choose to join us, which we hope you do. And grammar, also related to syntax, will be the topic of our April webinar. But again, just to sort of see how all these pieces fit together, I do want to also call your attention to the fact that background knowledge, which is one of our big ideas that we'll explore further, is very much related to vocabulary. And so we'll keep revisiting that key concept. Now, another idea that may or may not be familiar to you is this idea of constrained versus unconstrained skills. So I'm going to give you just a minute to look at these trajectories. So on the far left, you see a trajectory for articulation, and the x-axis has the age at which time children are bringing these skills online. So young children are starting to learn to articulate sounds between the ages of, well, they're babbling, some 2-3 months old, but you can see by age 4, the growth trajectory for articulation is almost at 100%, right? And so similarly, syntax, being able to put words into first 2-word sentences and then 3 words and then more complex sentences, that happens fairly rapidly. Phonological awareness is another, what we call constrained skills. What does that mean? It means that they consist of a limited number of items, which means that you can get to mastery at some point in time. And so when we think of phonemic awareness and phonological awareness and phonics skills, decoding skills, those are considered constrained. Again, they have a limited number of items. And once we teach those items, we help children to reach mastery of those skills because they're super important to learning to read. Now, you see I circled on this slide reading comprehension and vocabulary and composing, otherwise known as writing. Those are what we call unconstrained skills. That means that these are not mastery skills like decoding, right? And letter recognition. Rather, they take a lifetime to master, if ever. And so think about that, because that concept is really important to understanding how comprehension works. Again, if you tuned in last month, we showed you a scope and sequence for phonemic awareness and phonics. You can develop a scope and sequence for constrained skills. It's really hard, if not impossible, to develop a scope and sequence for comprehension and vocabulary and writing. It doesn't mean we don't need a roadmap to teach those skills. It just means we have to think conceptually about them very differently. And I hope that's helpful. One of the things that we want to talk about tonight is the types of texts that we're going to have our emerging readers be exposed to. And last time we talked about Jean Shaw's stages of reading development, and you see 3 out of 6 stages here. Stage 0, the predictable text stage of stage 1, where kids are reading code emphasis text, and stage 2, where they're reading authentic text. Well, we want to make a very important distinction here between the text that students are reading and the text that students are listening to. So as Nancy clicks, and you see for stage 0, where they haven't gotten that alphabetic insight, the text they're reading is going to be that predictable text where there's repetition and patterns to help scaffold and help them understand that alphabetic insight, so that they can get to stage 1, where a high percentage of the words on the text are phonetically predictable, what we often call code emphasis or decodable text, and the knowledge for the text matches what's already been taught, so the children have opportunities to practice. And then in stage 2, authentic text, right? Words are used in the text are based on the the content, rather than the syntactic or phonetic features. So just to give you an idea of what we're looking at when we're asking students to read, and we're building their comprehension of those texts. But we also want to remember that we're really going to be able to focus more substantively, if that's the right word, on comprehension skills if we pick text that's at least 1 to 2 grade levels above the student's reading level. And that's where we can do really nice read alouds and choose books that have more complex syntactic structure, more complex vocabulary words, etc. So again, just hopefully that's helpful to sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about tonight. Another important concept that I want to bring to light is something that Sticht and James talked about in 1984, and you might have seen this slide or this picture in the Common Core State Standards. The idea here, if you look at the x-axis and the age of the child, starting at 0, going all the way up through 14, and their level of comprehension, you notice that children's listening comprehension actually outpaces their reading comprehension until the middle school years. So what are the implications for that, right? The implications are just what we talked about in the prior slide, that we have to read rich text to our children and develop their listening comprehension skills, because they're not going to have the ability to comprehend at those higher levels with the text that they're reading until middle school, roughly. And why is that? They're still processing, they're still learning how to be good readers, trying to synthesize all the information that they have to, the heavy lift, the higher order thinking that's required when you are reading. So that's an important concept, I think, to keep in mind. Another important concept to think about with comprehension is we want to make sure that you, the listener, and our readers understand the difference between comprehension as a process versus comprehension as a product. And again, I think about reading words. When you ask a child to sound out a word, the product is their ability to blend those sounds and produce the word and know what the word means, of course. But you don't think about the process as much there, although there is that phonological processing component. In comprehension, however, we want teachers to understand that they're teaching their students how to, we'll talk more about this, create images, create representations of the text, basically create a mental model that is actually more about a process than it is about getting to a finished product. And I'll tell a quick story. When Nancy and I kind of sat down, if that's what we did, to write this book, I asked her, or maybe she asked me, I don't remember which it was now, what do most teachers do to see if kids comprehend the text? And one of us answered, they ask questions, right? And they usually wait till the end of the story or whatever the task is to ask the children the question. And that really gives the message that that's what we care about most. Like, there are some certain answers, you have to get them right, and that's the end goal. Well, we don't want teachers and kids to think that that's the end goal, because comprehension is too complicated, right? We want them to understand that comprehension is a process, and there's a lot that goes into that process, which we'll talk more about. And so when we talk about these processes that are involved in making meaning, comprehending, it's really what we're doing while we're reading that is so very important, because again, we're constructing meaning as we go. And so to focus on those processes, what we do as teachers is to help focus on what the reader needs to do while they're reading. And so maybe that's a think aloud, maybe that's asking questions. Oh, I'm wondering why Goldilocks decided to barge into the Three Bears cottage. So we're modeling what you do and what you're thinking while you're reading so that they understand this process. Now, our first big idea for this evening is background knowledge. And what is it? Simply defined here, the fund of information garnered from real life experiences, watching videos, listening to stories and informational texts, and eventually reading oneself. And what is it about background knowledge that's so very important? This quote comes from Dan Willingham. He wrote, "How knowledge helps. It speeds and strengthens reading comprehension and learning and thinking." And he talks about the fact that there are three things that we're doing, right, that help to build this knowledge. And the fact that knowledge brings more knowledge. So this three-stage process that we go through learning new things. The first is we have to take in the new information. The second is we have to think about that new information and process it. And then in order to retain it, we have to store it in memory. And so that three-stage process, whether you're listening to a text or reading it, is that process that helps us to gather knowledge and bring more knowledge. And honestly, without that, our students are really going to continue, the gap is going to continue to widen. That's why we're so focused on knowledge and background knowledge. And the next slide has a nice quote from Natalie Wexler, who wrote a very important book building on this whole idea and this concept of knowledge called The Knowledge Gap. And her quote here, whether or not readers understand a text actually depends far more on how much, not only background knowledge, but remember we said vocabulary too, how interconnected those two are, that they have relating to that topic, than how much they practice comprehension skills. And actually just listened to a podcast by Natalie Wexler this afternoon and reminding me about, the work that she did. And the book is actually quite enlightening and I highly recommend it. And she talks about how in her experience and sitting in on 2 classrooms over the course of a year, 2 second grade classrooms that use very different reading programs, how in one classroom, there was a lot of focus on comprehension strategies and teaching the skills related to comprehension. and not much time spent on building the student's background knowledge, and also getting across this idea of processing, or process, the comprehension as a process. And I just loved that reminder. So again, this we're reframing, I hope, for you what we believe is really important about comprehension. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Margie. And what I'd like to do is pick up on what Margie was saying about background knowledge, and to show you how we've tried to translate that importance and what we need to be doing with our beginning readers in terms of teaching them how to build that background knowledge. So when we set out to come up with an activity that was kid-friendly and kind of embodied what it is we're asking them to do, we came up with the idea of having them think about building knowledge as a tree that grows and gets more leaves and gets bigger over time. And so we literally built an activity using the image of a tree, which we then associate the trunk is the topic that they're learning about. The branches are those subtopics, or what we like to call categories of information within the topic. And then eventually all those little leaves that we can see on a tree are details about those various categories. So we wanted to use this very concrete image to get children engaged in this idea that information kind of exists in different levels, that kind of structure of informational text informational text in particular. So with that in mind, if we have a tree and we are starting an instructional unit and it happens to be about cats, we're going to label this tree cats. We're going to put a little sticky note on there, and everything we're going to be talking about or listening to or reading is going to be about that topic. And I want to just take one moment to give credit for a little bit of the inspiration for this topic or this activity, and that is Margie and I have had the great pleasure to be working collaboratively with ReadWorks, which has a wonderful website of free material for teachers to access for children from K through 12. And one of their activities that is very much building on this idea, or is the same as this idea, is to do an article a day, where children each day read an article and then they write in their book of knowledge. And that idea we really liked, and what we've tried to do here is build upon it by having students listen to multiple articles on the same topic instead of reading them themselves, because for beginning readers, they can't access the print yet, but we don't want to keep them from getting an opportunity to learn within a topic. So what we have done is a variation on the book of knowledge by doing knowledge trees, where every article is adding to the tree, as you're going to see here in a moment. So we actually have another collaborative effort going on with ReadWorks and with Whole Phonics, which we can talk more about at the end if we have more time. It's something soon to launch. But we have 3 articles here about cats. And the first one is Cats Need Care. And we would read this to the children, do a read aloud, talk about the vocabulary. And then what we would do is start to build out that tree. And we have our first branch is labeled Humans and Animals Living Together, or how we care for animals, the cats. And then we have other stickies that talk about all those details that were in that article about how we care for a cat. Then we read another article, article number 2. And in this article, we can see from the title, we're going to be talking about a different category of information, namely how cats feel. So now we're getting into an area of information that has to do with their behavior. So that's a new branch, and we add a new branch with a new sticky note. We add the colorful other notes that are the details, the leaves. And now we can see we have some details about the behaviors, namely cats, when they're relaxed, lie down, and so on. What the students are gaining by seeing this is that their knowledge is actually is building, is growing. And then the last activity, or the last article, excuse me, is mother cats and their kittens. And now this is yet another couple branches of our tree, namely, how does a mother cat care for the kittens, and what are some of the things that kittens need or like when they're baby cats. When students have finished doing these 3 articles and added all of these branches and leaves to the tree, what we can then do is use this as a graphic organizer to help students recall and retell the information that they have been gathering up across these articles. And of course, one thing that we aren't illustrating here is perhaps the students have some knowledge themselves that they didn't hear about in the articles. We can add some leaves from their prior knowledge so they can really see that this knowledge comes from not only what they're listening to, but from some of their prior experience. The next big idea that we told you we would talk about tonight is text cohesion. And the first question is, so what is text cohesion? What's really important about this is that this is where we try to help students understand that meaning is derived by understanding how one sentence is related to another, and how do we figure out how sentences are related to one another. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes. But first, we want to make a distinction between coherence and cohesion. They're related, but they're not the same. Coherence, which we talk about quite often, has a lot to do with making sense of text. But when we have coherence or talking about coherence, that's very dependent on what we already knew in order to then interpret what we're getting from the printed page. So this is, coherence really overlaps with what Margie was saying a moment ago about the reader's prior background knowledge, whether it's informational or experiential, and also their vocabulary. Because if we don't already have some of that prior information, text is much less understandable. I have my personal story on this. I can read an entire book on the theory of relativity. And when I get to the end of that, I'm still not going to understand the theory of relativity, even if I read every word correctly, because I have no prior concept of what that is all about. And so this is where that relationship to what I already know really impacts our understanding of the text. But let's now go back to something a little more teachable, which is text cohesion. First of all, why is it important? Well, Kanan and others recommend or point out that our ability to integrate meaning, that is, figure out how words are relating to each other across sentences, is what gets us from reading word by word, like lists of words, or just reading individual sentences, to actually reading connected text. Also, when we talk about text cohesion, it's our ability to recognize and use connective words, be they pronouns, conjunctions, adverbial phrases, are critical, and those are all teachable. And that's where we get really excited when there's something we can teach. Why is it important? Well, one of our wonderful allies in this area is Danielle McNamara and her colleagues, who say that increasing text cohesion improves readers' understanding and memory for text. So if we can help students do a better job with text cohesion, we are going to improve their understanding of what they're reading. So with that, let's take another look at what we have as our activity in the comprehension book that we're talking about this evening. And the one that we have in the book is called Text Links. And basically, this is an activity that draws heavily on pronoun referent work. And we're not going to illustrate that because we want to talk about something a little different. And that is, we also have in our book, Margie mentioned taking a look at what a text is demanding of us as the reader. And we wanted to provide for teachers what we're calling Q questions. That is, what can I as the teacher ask when I look at the text in order to help me get at these big ideas? So the Q questions are designed to help us, the teacher, analyze the text for the big ideas, be it background knowledge or text cohesion or the others that we have. And they're to help us focus on what Margie was talking about, which is the language processing requirements related to each of the big ideas. Our goal through these questions is for us to be better prepared when students start to read the text to draw their attention to the various aspects of the language processing requirements. So let's now look at the Q questions we've proposed for text comprehension. And I will say here that we were heavily influenced in how we shaped our questions by the work that McNamara and her colleagues did in developing the Cometrics tool for analyzing text. And they put a lot of emphasis on cohesive ties, and they divided them into two categories: referential, namely nouns, synonyms, and pronouns. And then they also have another category, which we'll look at in a moment, which are called deep cohesive ties. But let's stay focused on this one first. Our question that we think helps us get at these referential cohesive ties is to ask the question, who or what is the person, thing, or idea that this micro passage is about? And before I go on, let me just mention, we're talking about micro passages here because what we really figured out as we worked on this book is that if we try to analyze our way through an entire story or an entire article, we don't have time to do that. And often there are multiple things going on within any paragraph or article. But if we zero in and find some sentences or a paragraph that allows us to really help focus on the skill we're trying to develop, that everybody benefits, we, the teacher, and certainly our students. So back to who or what is the person, thing, or idea that this micro passage is about. So let's see how this might look. This is a little excerpt from a charming picture book, City Dog, Country Frog. And the question we would ask is, who or what is the person, thing, or idea that this micro passage is about? And if, in the interest of time, we won't take a lot of time to read it, but if we were to take time to do that, what we discover is that there's a repetition of city dog. We use the pronoun he to refer to the dog. And as we get near the end of this selection, the frog refers to the dog as a friend and you. And so what our students need to be able to do is to trace that referential chain, as Mary Shepherd Girl refers to it, to know that this whole time we're talking about this dog, this thing that we the whole story is about, or this whole portion is about. Now, I mentioned that the other type of cohesive ties that McNamara and her colleagues built into the Cometrics tool were deep cohesive ties. And these are things that we recognize as conjunctions, how words get joined together, adverbs or adverbial phrases that lead into the text and connect ideas from paragraph to paragraph and across the text. They tend to cluster into categories of being causal cues, intentional cues, and temporal. So let's go again and look at our text selection. And we would ask the question, are there causal, intentional, or temporal connections in this passage? take a moment to take a quick look and see if anything jumps out.
And
I'm
if
gonna
you see
show you.
anything, let's give you, oh, I was going to say, never mind. I was going to have them put their answers in the chat box if we have a moment for them
If
to
you
do
didn't
that.
see that, can you put your answers in the chat box? We'll give you another chance to do that on the next one. How's that?
Okay, sounds good.
So, we deliberately chose this little excerpt so we could illustrate all three. Certainly the reference to time is giving us a temporal connection. Waiting for you are those mental verbs that have something to do with purposefulness in what we intend to do. And waiting for is giving us that sense of intention. And then the word but, the conjunction but here is telling us that the frog was waiting for someone and then uses but. And from that, we know he wasn't necessarily waiting for the dog, but happily the frog lets the dog know, but you'll do. And it's such a wonderful way to frame this, but that word but is pivotal to appreciating what was going on with this exchange between the dog and the frog. Now, we talked last time about decodable text isn't the last thing, the only about decoding, that we really want students to be paying attention to what the words mean as they're going along. So we have a little decodable example, and we can ask the same question about are there causal, intentional, or temporal connections in this passage? And using Margie's idea, can anyone figure out what that might be? I bet you all can. So Zach has no cap. So Zach is sad. Obviously, I think you probably all decided it must be so, because it's the only transitional type word we have.
Yep, and that's what we said.
And what we want to do, even with two simple lines of decodable text, is to draw students' attention to the relationship that when Zach had no cap, it was what caused him to be sad, that there's a causal connection between the no cap and being sad. And we can do that even with our very, very early decodable text. So Margie, you're up with inference, our next big idea.
Thank you, Nancy. And one of the questions somebody asked is, can you give an example of how you would phrase the question that you had on the prior slide? And you're not going to actually use the words with the kids, causal, intentional, temporal, right? Although we use cohesive ties and teach them about cohesive ties and what those ties are and how they connect ideas. So I just wanted to
Thank you.
Yep, you bet. So big idea number 3, inferential thinking. What is it? Kate Kane is a renowned reading researcher, especially in the area of comprehension. And she talks about inferencing as a gap filling process. So we know there's something missing and we have to figure out what it is. And we have to use information in the text and also background knowledge. So again, we're bringing background knowledge back to us, back into the conversation and highlighting how important it is. And why is inferencing so important? Because you have to be able to inference to understand what you read or what you even listen to. It is considered a higher order cognitive skill, and it does contribute to this idea of a mental model. And I'll take just a minute to define what we mean by a mental model. It's also known as a situation model. Different researchers have called it different things. And what it is simply is, as someone is reading, as the reader is taking in information, they create a picture of what those ideas mean. So they create pictures in their mind or some representation of what it is that they're reading. And what they're images that you're creating are connected to your background knowledge as well as, of course, what you're reading. And in order to create those mental models, you have to, again, take the text you're reading and reconcile it with what you know. And sometimes it doesn't match, and you have to figure out, well, what do I do with that? But again, most authors don't tell us everything. They want us to figure things out on our own. And one thing I will say, because as I read through your chats and your questions as Nancy was talking, and someone asked about autism, children on the spectrum are known for having great difficulty with inferencing. And we're going to talk about a technique in a moment that helps children, all children, but especially children who are not as apt to making these visual images and representations as they read. So we're going to show you from our book part of a table that depicts some of the examples of activities that we do. And one of them is called, what is it? So I'm going to walk you through, what is it? So take a minute, and actually I'd love for you to put in the chat right now, what is this? Take a guess. And as you're thinking about this, I want you to first think about what it is and describe what it is that you see, and guess what the picture might be. And I see fish scales, honeycomb, shrimp, corn on the cob, fish scale, fish eggs, a snake skin belt. Okay, cool. Lots of great ideas. And now real quick, I want to ask you, what makes you say that? So what made you say honeycomb? What made you say corn on the cob? What made you say color, texture, shape, the bumps? Great. Okay, and this is what you would do for the children, right? You want them to first describe, and then you want them to explain why they came up with the example, so that they're articulating their guess. And of course, we always want them to use their oral language skills. So Nancy's going to show you, ta-da, what is it? Those of you who said fish scales, awesome. So again, now what I would say is, if you guessed right, that's fine. But if you didn't, what are you thinking now as you see the whole picture? What are you thinking? And you don't have to answer that question necessarily, but again, we are asking children to use inferencing skills to guess. And this is a great way to start. There's no words needed to read, just the whole idea of trying to figure something out when you don't have all the information in front of you. Somebody said misperceptions are very easy. So great. Thank you for participating. Now, I said that I was going to describe an activity that helps with inferencing, and this is something that I think everyone is probably familiar with, something called visualizing. And Nancy Bell created Visualizing and Verbalizing program that many of you have heard of, but you don't need to do that whole program. This is just a simple activity that you can do to help children who maybe have trouble creating these images. And this pretty simple. There's 4 things that you're going to ask them to do. First, you're going to select a picture, and this is a picture from that story that Nancy showed us some text from a little while ago. So you're going to show them a picture that has some interest, that might capture their, interest. And you might say, first of all, tell me what you see. And that's really something that jumps out at you. Okay, what do you notice? What do you see right away? And it jumps out at you. Okay, and the second thing that you would say is, I notice. Okay, now this is something that someone else might not see. So the first question is something that probably a lot of people will see. The second question is, what do you notice maybe that somebody else isn't going to see? So really looking at it from a different vantage point. And the next question that helps with this visualizing is, I think. So what is an interesting thought that you had when you looked at this picture? Okay, does anybody want to put something in the chat. What did you think? An interesting thought that you had. Somebody said a frog. Anything else? Reflection. Awesome. You notice the reflection. Friends. Is the dog drowning? Poor puppy. I think the dog is carrying the frog. How kind of the dog to hold the frog. This is awesome. These are the kinds of things that you want children to talk about here, because the more that they can articulate what they're thinking, what they're observing, the better able they're going to be able to create these images. It also helps them remember the details when they do these visualizing, and also to use their observation to help with their critical thinking, which we know comprehension is so much about critical thinking. So, and the last is I wonder. And the I wonder is, what do you want to know? So somebody said, is the dog drowning? I think the dog must be paddling. How did the frog get on the dog and why? So again, great questions. And you can come up with wonderful illustrations from books. That's a way to draw a child into wanting to read the book. So there's lots of ways to use this activity. All right, moving right along. So going back to these cue questions that Nancy talked about a few minutes ago, we definitely want to think about what questions we can ask. We think about these ahead of time to prepare the text to help with inferencing in this case. So what gap does the reader need to fill to understand this very simple decodable text? So take a minute to read it. Good. And in the next page, I'm not going to ask you to necessarily weigh in right now, but you can go to the next slide, Nancy. And what you're going to see in the next slide is that something happened, right? Zach has a hat. And his hat is a cap. Now what do you see? No, no, no. What? So we know something happened. We see the exclamation marks. There's some anticipation. Now Zach has no cap, right? So something happened, right? We had to make an inference. What is it that happened? Now, one thing I will say here is one of my wonderful mentors, Maureen, who may be listening in tonight, I don't know. She has a little boy, Miles, who's 4 years old, and he's using these wonderful whole phonics books to read and learn to read. And she sent me a video clip of him reading one of these texts the other night. It was adorable. And she actually covered the pictures. And it was great because something like this, you might cover the picture and then say, oh my gosh, what do you think happened to Zach's cap? And again, you want the child to infer and guess, you know, whatever, what was it? But now I'm going to show the picture, and maybe he got it right and maybe he didn't. But once he sees the picture, what happened to his hat is it blew away. There was a stiff breeze. So inferencing is extremely important, and there are inferences in almost all texts, including simple decodable texts. So as we start to kind of wrap up for this evening, and hopefully we have a few questions to ask or answer rather, want to just focus a little bit for a minute on the content that we believe is really important, not for the teacher to know and for the teacher to teach, and making a distinction between the two. For example, you heard us talk about coherence and cohesion and inference. Those are terms that we as teachers need to understand, because if we understand them, we can help our students learn those. But do we actually teach those terms? No. And one of you asked a really great question. Are we going to talk about referential cohesion to kids? Absolutely not. But we as the teacher need to know what that means and what are the implications for instruction based on the analysis of the text we talked about. Text structure. We didn't talk a lot about text structure today. We need to know that as a teacher. We also need to teach that. Text structure is a big idea. We chose not to focus on it tonight because a lot of teachers know how to teach text structure and do a good job, I think, with that. Reading, writing, connection. Again, we need to understand what the connection is. We also, very importantly, need to know how to teach it. That was a big idea that we felt was probably beyond the scope of tonight's webinar. But we do have a fair amount to say about that in the book. And last but not least here, we have text analysis. Again, we have to know about it. Are we teaching the child to analyze the text? No, we're going to analyze it for them and prepare it so that they can be successful. And of course, as always, our features of effective instructional practice that Nancy's going to walk us through now as we wrap up for the evening.
Right. Well, just quickly, we have applied these effective instructional principles across all of the books, and Comprehension is no exception. In the interest of time tonight, we just want to focus on two of them, number 2 and 6. First of all, what we've really tried to do in our comprehension activities is to make abstract concepts concrete. And the two of the activities we've done tonight, the knowledge tree, which really is attempting to make that knowledge building idea very concrete, is one example. The other is what Margie was illustrating a moment ago of how do we teach children, young children, what it means to try to figure something out from only part of the information, and covering up most of a picture and only seeing a little piece of it is a way we can help students understand what inferencing is all about without calling it necessarily inferencing. The other thing that we do want to spend a moment on is gathering data to guide instruction. And as Margie said earlier, I think our experience is that for the most part, we think of gathering information about comprehension as how many questions do the children get correct. But in light of our emphasis on the language and the comprehension that goes on while kids are reading, we have, and how that's often reflected through retelling, what we have created to help teachers are retelling rubrics, which are designed to help us monitor how students are doing. It's not as black and white as yes, no, you got the answer correct on a comprehension question, but it does give us some insight, or it can give us some insight in terms of how well students are increasing their ability to select and organize what they've been listening to or eventually reading. So the rubrics provide us with criteria for rating how kids do a retelling. Our rubric is definitely aligned with the big ideas, emphasizing what they're understanding while reading rather than answering questions. And certainly retelling captures young children's language usage. And by the way, we do talk about answering questions in our reading writing connection. So we have no axe to grind with asking questions, but we think it's also very important for us to focus on this oral retell. So what we've done is create a rubric very quickly. We've organized it down the left side with basically the parts of the knowledge tree, the topic, the major subtopics, details, and then of course how well the student is using language. And then we've classified or designed criteria for a beginning level, developing, and a proficient level, what we think you should be able to see. And just to see how this changes, if we use that little bit of text along the top, things grow in dirt, and we rated this using our rubric, we'd see that 3 out of 4 of our ratings would be at the beginning level because there's not a lot of detail, either the topic, the subtopics, etc. But then when we have another sample, this could have been the same child months later, but this is just a sample for the sake of illustration. we can see that now we do have a general statement of the topic. We do have supporting details. In fact, if you had read the articles, you'd see the student captured all of the subtopics, and their ability to use the language to convey this is showing some signs of cohesive ties and showing the relationship of one idea to another. So using a rubric, and we also have designed a similar tool for narrative retellings, it's possible for us to measure or at least monitor how the students is progressing, how students are progressing in this type of retelling activity. And then last but not least, we'd like to end by saying, literacy doesn't just happen during English language arts. And we shared this last time about phonemic awareness and phonics. And every one of these domains has a thread that can run through every other subject area. But of course, tonight, we want to show the relationship with comprehension. We've already talked about how it might be taught in English language arts if we're teaching a particular narrative story or using some informational text. But what if we also built a knowledge tree during social studies, and we're built a knowledge tree about our community, and the trunk is our community, and the branches are the people, the places, events that happen in our community, and then all those leaves would be the policeman, the fireman, the schoolhouse, the church. All of those details would be all over our tree. Or what if we built, of all things in math, a knowledge tree about shapes, geometric shapes, and we might have one branch that is shapes with angles and another shapes that have no angles. So we might have on one branch squares, triangles, and rectangles, and on another one circles and ovals. And instead of words, of course, at any point on these little details, we could be using pictures. And last but not least, building off of all of our conversation about cats, in science, we might be talking about the animal kingdom and the different groups of animals. So we might be talking about mammals, and we would have a branch that describes what makes a mammal, and then another one is, where do mammals live? What are their habitat? And each branch could become a category of information within that subject area. So we advocate for literacy throughout the day, and using some of these same activities reinforces these concepts throughout the day. So as you know, we love feedback. And while we're fielding a question or two, perhaps you could type into chat something that you learned this evening that you can apply in your own practice. We'd love to hear what those things might be. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Nancy and Margie. This is Kim. We addressed a lot of, Margie, thank you. We're addressing a lot of the questions in the chat as we were going along, but one question we'd like to pose to you while we have a minute or two is, when do you suggest having students answer written questions to check their comprehension? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Nancy, you start and I'll add.
Well, as I said a moment ago, we don't have any beef with answering questions, but what we do want to be sure we do is teach children how to answer the questions, especially if we're asking them to write a question. So we want to teach them how to look for the word that is asking us the question, like who was in the pool with the dog, from our picture a few moments ago. And then we would want to teach them how to replace that who with the frog, and then transform that question into an answer. Honestly, we think that can be done orally starting very early, and then transition to writing as the writing skills grow. So definitely that should be happening in conjunction with the retellings that we were talking about. Margie, you want to add to that?
Well, I want to put a plug in for our syntax webinar in April, because We'll talk a lot more about the types of sentence writing activities that Nancy just mentioned for this. And of course, syntax is really related to comprehension. So you'll see some common threads getting woven through from tonight till next month's webinar on syntax. And that's an area that we both feel is under taught. Is that the right word?
Underappreciated.
Underappreciated, not taught explicitly, because it's something I think teachers didn't necessarily feel they learned well themselves. So we're excited to share more about that. And as always, we really appreciate you tuning in tonight. Love your comments. Lots of positive feedback about the background or the knowledge trees, the rubrics, the inference activities. We're so happy to know that these are helpful. Try them out, send us feedback. We love hearing from you. And since it is actually right at 8 o'clock, I believe, in the interest of and honoring your time, we thank you again and hope to see you in April. Stay well.